We will focus on how entrepreneurs and firms go about raising funds for growth and development. As a firm progresses through the various phases of the life cycle, its needs, focus, and conditions change, requiring it to use different sources of capital. Firms typically sell stocks and bonds to raise capital, and so we will explain these processes. The business life cycle. A firm typically goes through 5 stages in its life cycle: startup, growth, maturity, decline, and closing. Each stage present unique problems, opportunities, and funding requirements. Business life cycles vary considerably. Some firms go through early stages fairly rapidly and then get settled in maturity for a long time, while others skip to the closing stage in a few years. The U.S. Census Bureau Business Information Tracking System estimates that roughly 60% of businesses that employ others besides the owners will close within their first 6 years. The life cycle approach is a useful way to discuss financing opportunities and sources for businesses. Borrowing for a startup or growing business. 5 sources of capital can generally be used to grow a business: personal funds, borrowed funds from family and friends, commercial bank loans, borrowed funds through business startup programs like the Small Business Administration, and angel financing or venture capital. Personal funds and family loans, although limited in scope, are often good starting points for most entrepreneurs and sole proprietorships. Professional lenders like commercial banks and venture capitalists view funding by family and friends as a sign that the business has potential. If you can convince your family and friends to support you, then it is deemed that you have a plausible business idea. If you cannot convince family and friends to get behind you and support you, how do you get strangers to support your business plan? Commercial bank loans constitutes the first source that people often seek after they've run out of family and friends to ask. Banks tend to be very conservative lenders, often requiring substantial collateral, income history, and evidence of stability. Startups are directly funded by commercial banks. Commercial loans through the Small Business Association are available to qualified small business applicants via a variety of loan programs, the most common of which is the 7A Loan Guarantee Program. The 7A Loan Guarantee Program administers loans to individuals or businesses that might not be eligible for a loan through normal lending agencies. Loan proceeds can be used for working capital and fixed assets, with repayment schedules extending up to 25 years. These loans are delivered through commercial lenders and guaranteed by the SBA. Interest rates tend to be quite competitive, but the major advantage to this program accrues to the bank since that the loan is backed by the SBA. Angel financing and venture capital is generally sought by entrepreneurs and businesses that would not qualify for commercial banks or SBA-backed financing. Angel investors are wealthy individuals and groups that are interested in providing initial funding for high-risk ideas. They typically have very short loan investment horizons, less than 10 years, and the upside limits of about $2 million. Venture capitalist firms or funds are also willing to fund high risk projects, but they have longer time horizons and higher funding limits. They generally provide the funding in stages. The stages of financing by venture capital are sometimes considered to be 4 phases. Phase one is the design prototype, and you can get funding up to about $800,000, and that stage is typically about 6 months. Phase 2 is small scale production. It's about $1.6 million, 12 months. Phase 3, marketing and distribution in selected markets, about another $1.6 million in about a 6 months time frame. And lastly, phase 4, full scale operations, production phase, about $4.5 million in 24 months. Entrepreneurs with strong, promising ideas could be in position to choose from a group of angel investors or venture capitalists. Factors to look for when picking a financier or a group of financiers include the financial strength. Will the financier have the necessary funding available to back your project until its completion? Contracts. Can the financier provide valuable contacts to help the entrepreneur reach his or her goal? The exit strategy. How much equity is the investor looking to acquire as a condition of providing funding? And how much of control is the entrepreneur willing to give up? Given that there is a high probability of failure among startups, angel investors and financiers commonly look for 60 to 100% potential annual rates of return on their successful ventures in order to provide funding. Borrowing for a stable or mature business. Typically, commercial banks provide much of the short-term financing required for the operations needed for a business via straight loans, discount loans, and lines of credit with or without compensating balances. A straight loan represents the simplest of all types of bank loans and are offered with a quoted APR and preset payment amount and intervals. Discount loans are offered to firms with the interest rate being already subtracted at the start. The difference between the amount the firm can use and the amount the firm has to be paid back at the end is its bank interest or discount earned. The loan amount is the amount due at maturity. Letters of credit or lines of credit is a pre-approved borrowing amount that, much like a credit card, the company can borrow money at a preset rate for the bank at any time without seeking additional approval of the loan each time it needs funding. The bank, however, is compensated based on the outstanding balance of the loan. The compensation can be a fixed interest rate, but often is a floating interest rate tied to the benchmark interest rate. This borrowing style has changing balances and changing interest rates, so it can be difficult to state the effective rate of the loan. Compensating balances. Loans work like lines of credit except that a portion of the loan may not be available to the borrower, even though the interest is paid on the full face value of the loan. For example, if a firm takes a loan of $100,000 at a rate of 7.5% per year and a compensating balance requirement of 15%, it will be able to use only 85% and will be charged $7,500 in interest per year. The effective rate will therefore be, the effective rate is equal to the interest paid divided by the amount used. So the effective rate is 8.82%. Corporate bonds represent a major source of long-term financing for established companies. Bonds are simply sold in $1,000 units and publicly auctioned or privately placed. The public issue of bonds is regulated by the SEC and typically involves the following 5 steps. The company selects an investment bank to help design and market the bond. An investment bank is an agent that works with the firm to meet the listing requirements of the bond, the design of the bond terms, and marketing of the bond and the auction of the bond. The company and the investment bank register the bond with the SEC, providing a prospectus and a reference and referencing the indenture of the bond. The bond is rated by the agency such as Standard & Poor or Moody's to help the potential buyers determine the appropriate price of the bond. Step 4. The investment bank markets the bonds to prospective buyers prior to the auction using the prospectus as the key information of the bond. And step 5, the auction is conducted to sell the bond. Two key documents that are required during the bond issuance process include the prospectus and the indentured agreement. The prospectus contains much of the information filed in the registration and is used to inform potential buyers about the bond. The indenture agreement is the formal contract of the bond between the issuing company and the eventual buyer. It includes vital information about the bond, such as the coupon rate, payment schedule, maturity date, and par value, as well as other restrictive covenants, provisions that restrict the activities of the issuing firm to increase the safety of the bond in the eyes of the potential buyer. Firms that issue coupon bonds have to make periodic coupon payments and a large lump sum payment at maturity. Sinking funds or reserved accounts are often set up by bond issuers to put away funding every year so that they have the necessary funds available to retire the bond when it matures. The other major source of capital for a firm to avail is common stock or equity. Equity holders get voting rights as part owners and share in the residual profits of the firm. Stocks are sold as initial public offerings when the firm goes public and seasoned offerings for subsequent issues. The initial public offerings and underwritings, the firm sells stocks to the public with the help of an investment banking firm who perform due diligence and are experts in marketing the issue. The investment bank partners with the issuing firm in exchange for compensation that can be set up on a best effort basis or on a fixed commitment basis. Under the best effort arrangement, the investment bank pledges to use the best effort to sell all the authorized shares and to take a cut on each individual share sold, but provides no guarantee as to how many shares will be sold. The more shares sold, the higher the payoff for the investment bank. Under the fixed commitment arrangement, this is also known as the underwriting agreement or arrangement. The investment bank guarantees a fixed amount of proceeds to the user. The investment banker makes up and keeps the difference between the actual selling price and the guaranteed price. Registration, prospectus, and tombstones. All new issues of shares have to be registered with the SEC prior to being sold in the capital markets. Once the application is filed, the approval process can take anywhere from 20 to 40 days, which is the cool-off period. During the waiting period, the issuer can circulate preliminary prospectus, which we call red herring, information informing potential investors of the issue. No commitments can be obtained from buyers until after the SEC approves. If information is missing, the SEC issues a comment letter requiring corrections and a new application to be filed. Once refiled, the cool-off period starts again. During the waiting period, the issuer and the investment bank place large advertisements, tombstone ads in newspapers and magazines containing the name of the issuer, some details about the issue, and a list of participating investment banks. There are two exceptions to the usual SEC registration process requirement. If the issue has a maturity of less than 270 days, or if the issue is worth less than $5 million. The marketing process, or what we call the road show, involves taking the issue on the road to attract interest among potential investors. This process usually lasts about 2 weeks and enables the investment banker to get a feel for what price should be set. After a successful roadshow and marketing campaign, a price is set and the issue proceeds forward to be auctioned off in the primary capital market. The auction takes place on a single trading day, during which time buyers submit their bids at preset prices. If oversubscribed, the bids are filled on a pro rata basis until all shares are sold. The aftermarket, dealers in the shares. After completion of the auction, the outstanding shares trade in the secondary market, and the investment banker typically functions as a dealer in, in the stock at a minimum of 18 months, for which the bank is given a green shoe provision. The green shoe provision allows the investment banker the right to purchase up to 15% of additional shares over a 30-day period beyond the offered to the public during the auction, so that the maintaining inventory and fill any pent-up demand. After standard agreements is a lockup agreement, which requires the original owners of the firm to maintain their shares of stock for 180 days so as to prevent dumping the stock and a free fall of the price due to profit taking on market of the original on part of the original investors. Commercial paper and bankers' acceptance are two other popular financing options used for mature businesses. Commercial paper is a discounted note sold by the company directly to an investor with both principal and interest repaid within 270 days, just like a treasury bill. These issues typically have a face value of $100,000, putting them out of reach for most small business and most small investors. It is generally assumed that institutional and sophisticated investors purchase commercial paper. The reason firms are issued commercial paper over other forms of borrowing is that they can get lower rates through commercial banks, and since they mature within 270 days, they qualify for short-term registration with the SEC. A banker acceptance is a short-term credit agreement arranged by the firm and guaranteed by the bank. It is ordinarily used to finance inventory and other assets that will be self-liquidated over a relatively short period of time. Its specific purpose is to promote trade. Typically involves an importing firm having the invoice guaranteed by the bank and sent over to the exporter as assurance of payment within the next few months, typically 60 to 90 days. The exporter turns in the bank acceptance to his bank in exchange for a reduced payment, and in return, the bank in the exporting company takes title to the exported goods until the payment is received. The importing firm is able to finance its purchases and releases the funds as inventory is liquidated. Companies raise funds for growth in debt and equity markets. Investors have different investors have different risk preferences, and companies have varying risk profiles. The cost that a firm pays for its debt a rate of return that investors demand to purchase equity in a firm depends largely on the firm's debt rating and the beta or systematic risk measure. Riskier firms end up paying higher yields on debt securities and are expected to pay a higher rate of return on their equity, thereby raising their average cost of capital. Financing leverage is the ability that owners have to use other people's credit or creditors' money at fixed rates to make higher rates of return that would have been possible by using all of one's own money. It represents one of the main benefits of taking on debt. The firm that takes on debt as part of their capital structure and are therefore known as leveraged firms, while those that do not take on debt are known as unlevered firms. One way to measure the benefits of leverage is by comparing the earnings per share of firms with the different capital structures under good and bad economic conditions. If the firm's earning before interest and taxes covers the interest costs, higher leverage benefits the stockholder with higher earnings per share. However, if the firm's earnings before interest and taxes do not cover interest costs, the reverse is true. The pecking order hypothesis is based on the notion that the firm has a preferred order of raising capital. Accordingly, it states that number one, the firm prefers internal financing, retained earnings first. If external financing is required, the firm will choose to issue the safest or cheapest security first, starting with debt financing and using equity as a last resort. The firms prefer internal financing first because it typically requires less effort, transaction costs, and loss of secrecy. Firms choose to issue cheapest security first and use equity as a last resort. The retained earnings are limited. Firms have to use other external forces such as debt and equity. When they do tap the capital markets, firms tend to issue debt first since it costs less and leads to less loss of control, and equity last as since too much debt can put the firm into a risk of bankruptcy. So in summary, there are three implications of the pecking order hypothesis. Number one, profitable companies will borrow less because they have more internal funds available and may have lower debt to equity ratios because they have more debt capacity. Two, less profitable companies will need more external funding and will first seek debt financing in a systematic world, avoiding the equity market. And three, as a last resort, firms will sell equity to fund investment opportunities.